Also, please give a round of applause for Michael Herman. Without his vision, this workshop would not have been possible. I'd like to start out by asking all of you a question. Does anyone in this room love TED Talks? Raise your hand. Does anyone wonder how they ever got by before TED Talks existed?
Yeah.
I know I did. Do you ever stop to think about, though, why you love TED Talks so much? I want you to take a moment, and I'd like to ask for some volunteers to tell me, why do you love TED Talks so much? What have you personally gained from listening to TED Talks? Anyone? Yes?
I love TED Talks because it's extremely informational. It's given me kind of authority to own my power. I've seen a few examples on TED Talk of women giving speeches about how you have to fake it to make it. Have you guys seen that one? That one's great, right?
Yeah.
So she's giving you all these ideas, put your hands up in the air, so that you kind of
Great.
own and become something bigger and better.
Great, so empowering is one thing that you mentioned.
That's the word I'm looking for. Yes, thanks.
Anybody else? Aria.
For me, TED Talks are very inspirational because every speaker there is very passionate about the subject matter they're speaking about, and they always speak from a place of authenticity, and it always grabs me.
Great. So inspirational, authentic, and one more person? Yes.
It's informational. There's a lot of new ideas, new invention being presented.
Great.
I
So
learned a lot.
new ideas. Most of the people in this room are officers in your respective clubs. And I'd like you to now imagine that your club members are like TED viewers. They're coming to Toastmasters, which is sort of like a TED Talk. And they're looking to be empowered. They're looking to be inspired. They're looking for authenticity. They want people to tell it like it is. And they're looking for new ideas. They don't know how to become a better speaker themselves, so they're coming to Toastmasters because they want to learn how to become a better speaker. This is why we're all here tonight, because evaluation is the tool that you can use. The officers are like those TED speakers, and you can inspire your club members through your evaluations. And then those club members can give evaluations and inspire other club members. And it becomes this big track where everybody's coming back, everybody's inspired, and everybody's making progress. So today we're going to talk about how to actually go about doing that. And I have a handout so you can follow along. This takes place both before the meeting, during the speech itself, during the evaluation, and after the meeting. So we'll talk about different tactics that you can use in each of these circumstances. So it all starts before the meeting. Before the meeting, it's very important for the Toastmaster or the Vice President of Education, depending on the club, different people might be coordinating the actual meeting, to send out an email saying who are the speaker and evaluator pairs for that meeting. Once they've done this, the evaluators can reach out to the speakers either over email or phone, and they can find out what the speaker's project objectives are, as well as what their personal objectives are. I recently was a guest at a club and I gave an evaluation, and from the moment I knew I was an evaluator, I got an email with the speech objectives, the speaker, the speech title, and I gave the speaker a call. And what I found out was that the speaker, even though he was working on Project 1 of the Entertaining Speaker Manual, his larger goal was actually to potentially use the speech for the International Speech Contest. This was actually very helpful because in my evaluation, I focused more on the speaker's personal goal in addition to touching a little bit on the humor in the speech. Another thing you have to keep in mind if you're the speaker is that in order to get an effective evaluation, the speaker needs to prepare for their speech. This may seem sort of silly, but I've actually been in an evaluation contest where the target speaker came up and they were not prepared for their speech. I watched the evaluators come up and they could not find one positive thing to say about the speaker. And not only that, they couldn't find anything to suggest for improvement because the fact that the speaker didn't prepare overpowered anything that the evaluator could have seen to suggest improvements. So it's actually very important for the speaker to prepare for their speech. And finally, as club officers, something that you can do is create a club climate where you're encouraging your members to be both active in the club as well as getting to know each other as people. I like to think of it this way. Has anyone worked in a company where they brought in external consultants to try to help you figure out how the company should be run? How did you feel when that happened to you? I know maybe you were a little bit open-minded, but if it was me, I might be sitting back saying, what do you mean these people are going to tell me how to run this company? I've been here 5 years. I think I know better than them, and who are they? They haven't been here. They've been here like 2 days. The same thing can happen in your club. If you have an evaluator that's not active in the club and hasn't gotten to know the speaker beforehand, the speaker can actually get a little bit defensive and not actually benefit from the evaluation. So during the actual speech as an evaluator, what can you do to ensure that your evaluation is as effective as it can be? Here's a couple of things that I recommend. First of all, rather than trying to fill out the form from the manual during the speech, actually recommend taking a blank sheet of paper and setting up a structure for yourself on that page that works for you. I'm very fond of the sandwich method. I think many of you have heard of it, where what I do is I set up on my paper strengths and areas for improvement. I try to list at least 3 strengths and at least 3 areas for improvement that I'll cover in my evaluation. And I also make sure to just write on the top of the sheet the speaker's name, the title of the speech, the project that they're working on, because you don't want to forget that when you're delivering the evaluation. But I do think it's helpful to start with a blank slate, but with the structure in mind so that you're really ready once it comes time to give that oral evaluation to do it. Once you have this structure, it's time to sit back and enjoy the speech. I have to say that when I started evaluating, I had this mentality, sort of like I was a college student in a large lecture. I really felt like I had to take so many notes because I didn't know what was going to be on the test. And this is not effective when you're evaluating, because you really can't even take in the most important parts of the speech. They might be things that are very subtle, and you can only take those parts in when you're really engaged in the speech. So when I'm an evaluator, I like to smile at the speaker, I nod my head, I try to follow what they're saying, and this ensures that I will really give an effective evaluation that's tailored toward the speaker. And finally, I do suggest taking notes during the actual speech. It's surprising how many people don't do this, but I recommend, as opposed to taking copious notes, to take more abbreviated notes. If there's some phrase that the speaker used, maybe just jot down that phrase. You don't have to write a whole sentence about they use body language by doing this. Just write the example of the body language, and you'll remember it when you go up to give the evaluation, and you'll be able to give a narrative around that at that point. And now really the meat of it, what do you do during the actual evaluation? And this is where the art of effective evaluation comes into play, because it really is an art. But I'd like to touch on a couple of things to keep in mind when you're giving an evaluation. First of all, one of the primary goals of an evaluator is to motivate the speaker. In that respect, it's very important to recognize the strengths that the speaker already has, in addition to recognizing improvements that the speaker has made over time. And that's really where getting to know the speaker before the speech comes in handy. It's surprising that speakers don't actually recognize as strengths things that they're naturally good at, because they didn't really have to work for it, and they may not even realize that they have these strengths. So it's important to point those out so that the speaker knows about it. In terms of improvements, actually last week I gave a speech at Bryant Park Toastmasters, and on one of my written evaluations, I actually got an evaluation from Jan Nolte, who's one of our evaluators tonight. And she wrote on the form that she saw a marked improvement in my ability to have a relaxed body when I was speaking. This really meant a lot to me because this was something that I'd been working on for a long time. So for Jan to actually notice that and recognize it in the written form just really meant so much to me. The next thing I would recommend is to use language effectively. As we know in Toastmasters, it's not necessarily about what you say, but often about how you say it. In evaluations, I recommend using descriptive language, always speaking in a positive way. So for example, if you're giving suggestions for improvement, I like to use phrases like, I challenge Jim in his next speech to do this. Or, Alok had a great opportunity here. Because really, who doesn't love challenges and opportunities, right? And also, it's very important to speak from a personal place. And this goes along with what we mentioned before about authenticity, about being honest. It's not about how the speech was supposed to affect you. It's about how the speech did affect you. So it's great to use personal language such as I felt. And I also recommend speaking in the third person as opposed to using the word you, because sometimes if you say you should do this or you failed to do this, the speaker feels a little bit self-conscious. So I recommend speaking in the third person and always speaking from a personal place about how you felt during the speech. Another important objective for an evaluator is to show the speaker how they can improve. So instead of just pointing out the areas for improvement, actually help them to do this in the next speech. So for example, if you're going to talk about eye contact, instead of saying something like, Peter's eye contact was very darty, I felt he was very distracted, and I just really couldn't focus on the speech. Does this show Peter how he can actually improve for the next speech? I don't think it does. So instead what you might say is, next time I recommend that Peter look at each person for 3 seconds and demonstrate this as you're talking about it. That Peter look at each person for 3 seconds and then move on to the next person for the next point. And in this way, Peter will be able to really engage his audience members in what he's saying. This creates a whole different perspective, and the speaker will actually be motivated to now make this change. One last area that I'd like to talk about is to really tailor your evaluation towards not only the speaker, but actually the situation that the speaker's in. We already talked about knowing the speaker's objectives, both for the project and the personal objectives, but there's also the situation that the speaker's in. A few years ago, I was at one of my Toastmasters clubs, and I was evaluator for a speaker. This speaker is someone that had always done humorous speeches in the club, and he'd actually competed in many humorous speech contests. But this time was a little bit different. He'd actually been out of the club for 6 months because unfortunately his father had passed away. So when he came back to the club, he was actually there, his mom was there to support him, and he gave this speech which was about how to find the light again after his father passed away. So when I went up to evaluate him, I'm usually very enthusiastic as an evaluator. I went up there, I had my sandwich method, I had my 3 strengths, my 3 areas for improvement, wrap it up all in a positive note, talked about the speech objectives. I thought it was great. But then after the meeting, one of my fellow club members came up and said, you know, I know you really love public speaking, and I know you really love evaluating, but this person's father just passed away. And sometimes it's actually more important to be able to match the energy of the speaker in your evaluation and have some compassion. That can be actually more important than giving that formal evaluation for them. These are just a couple of things to keep in mind when you're giving your evaluations. And then lastly, after the meeting, it's very important to speak to the speaker, because this way the speaker actually has a chance to respond to your evaluation. They can react to it, say maybe they agree with it, they didn't agree with it, and they can also think about what they can take from this evaluation and how they can use it for their next speech. All of these come together, both the work you do before the meeting, during the speech, during the evaluation, after the meeting. This will create a club climate of healthy evaluations and will really encourage your members to come back to your club meeting after meeting and always be growing. So now we have some amazing speakers and evaluators to share with you tonight, and we're going to have our interactive evaluation workshop portion of the meeting. Each of you has 3 evaluation forms, so 2 of those evaluation forms can actually be used to evaluate the speakers. And you can use the techniques that I spoke about today. The third form is actually going to be to evaluate the workshop as a whole, which we'll do later. We're actually going to have the first speaker go, we're going to have the 2 evaluations, and the second evaluator will leave the room during the first evaluator so that the evaluations are kept separate and don't really influence each other. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for tonight. Move this away. Our first speaker for tonight is, also, while these speakers and while the evaluators are speaking, I'd like you to really pay attention and see how they use some of these techniques that we discussed, or anything else that you feel was effective, because in the discussion we're going to talk about how their evaluations were effective, and also if you have suggestions for improvement. So I'd now like to welcome up our first speaker. He's from Bryant Park Toastmasters. His name is Anthony Smith, and he will be doing Project 6 from the Competent Communicator Manual, Vocal Variety. Anthony's speech is entitled, It's All About the Prep. Please help me to welcome up Anthony Smith. It's all about the prep.